Today in our discussions, we're using a very general framework for our discussions. In fact, at the moment we're using the framework of the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths was, of course, the very first teaching that the Buddha gave after achieved enlightenment. And it's the foundation of all Buddhist traditions. And as we saw this morning in the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha is really being like our doctor, diagnosing what our current condition is, why we're stuck in that state. And in his prognosis, he has the prognosis that we actually can do something about it. We can go beyond this unsatisfactory state we find ourselves in. We can liberate ourselves from all suffering and its causes and achieve a healthy state called nirvana. And in the fourth noble truth, the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering, the Buddha prescribes the medicine. What medicine do we need to take to achieve that healthy state? And so what we've seen in the first noble truth, the condition we find ourselves in, the original Sanskrit word was dukkha, very difficult to translate into English, most commonly translated as suffering, but this can create some confusion because that word suffering there is not the same meaning as we normally associate with the word suffering. It has a much broader meaning. Including that word dukkha includes not only our unpleasant experiences, but of course our pleasant experiences, and the fact that there's always a potential to suffering to arise in our life. And so the second noble truth, what is the underlying cause? Why are we stuck in this state of dukkha? There we saw very briefly two elements, the mental afflictions and then the actions that are driven by those mental afflictions. These two in combination lead to the state of dukkha. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is first have a look at the first of those two elements, the mental afflictions. And then I'd like to look at how the whole process works. So let's start by looking at the mental afflictions. Mental affliction is a translation of the Sanskrit word klesha. And the word klesha means something that agitates or disturbs the mind. So mental afflictions are the mental factors that agitate or disturb the mind. Sometimes this word klesha is translated not as, in other words, you'll see instead of mental afflictions, you'll see disturbing emotions, afflictions, delusions, many different translations. But I think the word mental affliction is quite close to the original meaning of the word, that we have mental factors which afflict the mind, that disturb the mind. And as we saw earlier, when we have a comprehensive presentation of these mental afflictions, you'll see a presentation of 6 root mental afflictions and 20 secondary mental afflictions. But we're going to focus on the condensed version there, the core main mental afflictions. Again, which we briefly looked at earlier, the 3 poisons, the core, the root mental afflictions. The first is ignorance, which is a translation of the Sanskrit word avidya. And vidya means knowing, and is negation. So not knowing. So ignorance here in general is defined simply as a mind that is, or a mental factor, a mind that is confused about its object. But here in the three poisons, we're talking about a specific type of confusion. And that is, here in the three poisons, the ignorance is confused, or a deluded state of mind that is confused about the nature of reality, how things exist. And this ignorance can take a number of forms. We can be confused in a number of different ways about how things exist. In a very simple way, we can be confused about the fact that things are changing moment by moment. So one thing that we're confused about is that we believe that things are stable. That things are not really changing. Now, of course, intellectually, we know that there's no such thing as a stable thing. Science has conclusively proven that everything is changing moment by moment. If we go down to the atomic, subatomic level, there's just flux and change happening all the time. So we learnt this at school, and I think intellectually we all know that everything's changing moment by moment. But are we behaving in that way? And the answer, I think, is no, because our behaviour is not really driven by our intellectual understanding. Our behaviour is driven by our instinctive habit. And our instinctive habit, or our instinctive ignorance, is telling us that things are quite stable. That, this laptop's more or less the same laptop that was here yesterday, the same laptop here tomorrow. That's how we relate to things. So experientially, we have this ignorance that we're grasping onto things instinctively as being quite stable and unchanging. So of course this is completely out of sync with reality. Another way in which we have ignorance, or we're distorting reality, is that we grasp on to what's called autonomous self. That we instinctively feel that somewhere here is a me. And this me that seems to be here seems to be something more than just the body and the mind. There seems to be something in addition to the body and the mind. That thing is the autonomous self. The me that seems to be here seems to be very autonomous, meaning self-sufficient, not really depending on anything else to exist. We have this sense of me. And that, according to Buddhism, is a false sense of me. There is no autonomous self here. There is not a me that is something more than the body and the mind here. But we believe that, and that creates a lot of suffering, mental afflictions and suffering. And a third level of ignorance that we have is that we instinctively feel as if there's an independent me here and an independent objective world out there. But again, according to Buddhism, if we investigate, we'll come to see that there is no independent me, no independent objective world. Of course, we're not saying there's no me and no world. We're just saying that these two things do not exist independently. So these are some types of ignorance that we are currently caught up in instinctively. This word ignorance, sometimes here in the three poisons you'll see a different word. And the Sanskrit word or Pali word is moha. And that's often translated as confusion or delusion. Just another name or word for ignorance. I don't want to go into this anything more here because I'm going to look at this in more detail on Saturday when we look at the Vipassana practice. But is there any basic questions here about this now? Yeah.
What's this? Before we talk about the mind, the next lesson, then we say there is a consciousness and there is a mind.
Sure.
And now we are saying there is no one.
No.
No.
We're saying there's what, sorry?
Autonomous.
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 Autonomous means self-sufficient, not needing to rely on anything else to exist. That's what autonomous means.
Relying to anything else?
Not relying on anything else.
Okay, but actually she, the independent. What's the
This
difference?
is, we're going to look at this, but this is a little bit more subtle than this. Because there are all Buddhist schools, philosophical schools, say there's no autonomous self.
No atom.
No autonomous self. All Buddhist schools are in agreement. Some Buddhist schools say there is an independent me. So you can reject this and still hold on to this. So this is a little bit more subtle idea. They're not exactly the same. But more about that we'll look at on Saturday. Okay. What I want to focus on in this session is the other two of the three poisons, which are attachment and aversion. Attachment in Sanskrit is raga, aversion in Sanskrit dvesha. So first I want to define them and then we'll look at each one in more detail. Attachment, or raga in Sanskrit, is defined as a mental factor that sees its object as attractive. It exaggerates the object's attractiveness and then wishes to possess and hold the object. So again, attachment is a mental factor that sees its object as attractive, it exaggerates the object's attractiveness, and then wishes to possess and hold the object. Why? Because it believes that's the source of our happiness. Aversion, or dvesha, is sort of the opposite of that. And here, in the three poisons, often instead of aversion, you have listed as the third poison, anger. Anger is a specific type of aversion, very strong type of aversion, that is very destructive. So it often gets a lot of focus in Buddhism. So I want to focus on anger here. So how is anger defined? Anger is defined as a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive, it exaggerates the object's unattractiveness, and then wishes to harm the object. So again, here anger is defined as a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive, it exaggerates the object's unattractiveness, and then wishes to harm the object. Why? Because it believes the object is a source of our suffering. So with both of these, we see a factor of exaggeration. And this is common throughout mental afflictions. That mental afflictions exaggerate or distort what we see in front of us. And this is also something commonly understood or known within psychology. In fact, here I've got a quote from one of his Dalai Lama's books where he says, "Recently, a psychotherapist told me that when we generate anger, 90% of the ugliness of the object of our anger is due to our own exaggeration. This is very much in conformity with the Buddhist idea of how mental afflictions arise." So also in psychology, it's very well understood that these mental afflictions exaggerate and distort. And the Buddhist assertion is that these two primary mental afflictions are coming from the fundamental ignorance. And we're going to look at how that happens, or how that occurs, a little bit later this afternoon. And all the other mental afflictions come out of one of these three or a combination of them. So if we can focus on these three mental afflictions, then we can really be effectively working with all mental afflictions. Now, what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit more about both attachment and anger, because I think there's a lot of confusion about these two mental afflictions. And first I'd like to look at anger. Now, most of us understand that anger can be very destructive, and it's something that we would like to eliminate. But sometimes, even so, sometimes the argument is that, okay, anger seems to be as destructive, but actually, sometimes I need anger. I need it to work through difficult situations. If I didn't have that anger, I'd have no driving force to work through difficult situations. That's the argument. Of course, there's no doubt that there's a lot of energy to anger, and it is a strong driving force. No doubt about that. But it's out of control force. Because remember, anger distorts what we apprehend. We're not seeing clearly things if we are caught up in anger. And we know from our own experience, if we have very strong anger, then often we later regret what we said and we did when we were angry, because we completely exaggerated and distorted the situation. And we overreacted. So the Buddhist answer to this is we don't need anger to deal with difficult situations. Rather, we should have patience. But again here, when this is explained, then often people have a mistaken idea what that means. Because often when we hear that, oh, be patient, people think, oh, I know what that means. It means sit there and do nothing. This is not patience. Well, certainly not, at least according to Buddhism. In Buddhism, patience is not a behavior. Patience is a mental attitude. So patience in Buddhism is defined simply as an undisturbed mind in the face of a difficult situation. So the Buddhist answer is, if we're faced with a difficult situation, don't allow mental afflictions to take hold of your mind, such as anger and so forth, because we're going to react inappropriately, it's going to be a mess. Rather, be patient, which simply means remain calm. Have a calm, clear mind in the face of a difficult situation. This is patience. Then we have a better chance of more accurately evaluating that situation without exaggerating or distorting it. And then we have a better chance to respond in a more constructive way. So with patience, we can respond in a better way. So patience is simply remaining calm in the face of a difficult situation. And then what is the driving force that we need in the difficult situation? And that is compassion. Often people on the surface feel like anger is a sign of strength, compassion is a sign of weakness. Actually, it's the exact opposite. Anger is a sign of weakness, meaning we can't effectively deal with it, so we have to resort to anger to deal with the situation. Whereas compassion is a sign of strength. And compassion can be very forceful. But when we have compassion, and this is what we're going to see a lot later, is it needs to always come with wisdom. Always. Otherwise, compassion can lead to difficulties. So when we're faced with a difficult situation, then compassion is the wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering. So if that other person, let's say it's another person who's behaving badly, then normally we react with anger. We get angry at them, attack them. And then often, we know from our experience, often then things get a little bit out of control and we don't really resolve it very well. Whereas if someone's behaving badly, instead of getting agitated, irritated and disturbed, remain calm, evaluate clearly what's going on, and then with compassion, meaning having a wish for them to be free of suffering and its causes, then we can respond by addressing their negative behaviour, by helping that person to overcome that negative behaviour. And if they're behaving in a bad way, not tolerate that negative behaviour and do whatever we can to help overcome that negative behaviour. So we can have that compassion can be very forceful if necessary. Now, when we talk about anger, then the question is, why actually do we get angry in the first place with people who behave badly? Particularly people who try to harm us. And related to that is, why is it then so difficult to have compassion for them or forgiveness for them? And related to that, and I'll try and answer that in the same way, why is there this epidemic of low self-esteem, self-hatred and guilt in our society? And I think all of those questions can be answered in the same way. If someone is engaging in some harmful behaviour, then the correct perspective is to simply see there's a person who's doing a bad or harmful action. Often when we see this situation, this is often not our perspective. Often our perspective is there's a bad person, there's a nasty, horrible person. This is cognitive fusion. Fusion, of course, means to stick two things together, make them one thing. And cognitive means to mentally do that. So we mentally fuse the person to their behaviour and see one thing, bad person. So of course this is an invalid perspective because there are two things here. There's the person and their behaviour. If we do this cognitive fusion, we're in trouble. Because in any given situation, we've got two options. Accept or reject. Generally, if someone's behaving badly, we reject. But if we reject with cognitive fusion, what we do is we end up rejecting or attacking the person. We get angry, we attack the person. And if we understand that getting angry and attacking the person is not very helpful, then the only other option available instead of rejecting is accepting. But if we accept and we do cognitive fusion, we end up accepting their bad behaviour. Both of those options, of course, are not very helpful. And then on top of that, it becomes almost impossible to have forgiveness or compassion for this person. Because to have forgiveness or compassion for a bad person feels like what we're saying, oh, what you did is okay, I don't mind. Of course we should mind. But that's why it feels like not only is it very difficult to have forgiveness or compassion for a bad person, but we often feel they don't deserve it because they're a bad person. So by doing cognitive fusion, also that leads to nearly being impossible to have forgiveness or compassion, even to the point of saying they don't deserve it. And even worse than that is when we do this cognitive fusion and we fuse the bad behaviour to the person and see him as a bad person, it becomes almost impossible to acknowledge any good qualities that they have. Because bad people don't do good things. So if they happen to do a good thing, oh, they didn't really mean it because they're a bad person. So we can't even acknowledge their good qualities because every person has both good qualities and faults. Everybody. But if we do the cognitive fusion and see people as bad people, we can't acknowledge, or it's very difficult to acknowledge any of their good qualities. So we end up with a completely biased view of that person. Of course, the simple solution to all of this is don't do cognitive fusion because it's actually an invalid false perspective. Simply adopt the correct perspective. That is, acknowledge or see there's a person doing a harmful behaviour. So if we have the correct perspective, then we can have compassion for the person, and at the same time reject their negative behaviour and help that person to overcome their bad behaviour so we can address their bad behaviour. And then also we will have a balanced view of that person, not the biased negative view of the person. We'll see that that person sometimes is doing some bad behaviour and sometimes they're doing good behaviour. So we'll have an more accurate, balanced view of the person. So I think a lot of our difficulties in this regard is simply coming from this cognitive fusion. We not only do this with others, we do it with ourselves. If we have done a bad behaviour, instead of having the correct perspective and simply acknowledging, I have done some harmful behaviour, we often have this perspective, I am a bad person. So if we do this, same scenario, we end up attacking ourselves. Often we then accept our bad behaviour by denying, I didn't do that. And then it also becomes impossible or very difficult to have forgiveness or compassion for ourselves. I don't deserve it. I'm a bad person. And we end up with a completely biased, lopsided view of ourselves. So again, the solution, the simple solution is don't do cognitive fusion because it's a false perspective. Simply acknowledge, I have done a harmful or bad behaviour. We can have compassion for ourselves and address our negative behaviour and overcome that negative behaviour. And this is the difference between guilt and regret. If we've done something harmful and we feel guilty, what are we focusing on? Bad me. Guilt comes from cognitive fusion. So guilt comes from a false perspective. Guilt is completely useless. All it does is it makes us feel bad, it paralyses us. It's not even addressing our bad behaviour. So we don't need to feel guilty about anything. Unfortunately, it seems like guilt has been used over the centuries as a mechanism to have power over people, because it does, it paralyses people. Whereas, if we've done a harmful behaviour and we regret, what are we regretting? our bad behavior. So regret comes from a correct perspective. This is very helpful because then we can regret our negative behavior and look at ways of overcoming that negative behavior. So whether it's with respect to ourselves and others, cognitive fusion, this false perspective just leads to a lot of difficulties. Any questions about any of this? Usually there's lots of questions.
It feels to me that the only way to avoid fusion is to develop first compassion. Is there any other way, or is it right? How can I...
No, to avoid cognitive fusion.
Yeah.
Well, cognitive fusion is just a way of thinking and speaking. So, unfortunately, in our society, we've sort of grown up doing cognitive fusion. So we just have to reprogram ourselves to not think and speak in this way, but to think and speak in this way, that's all. And the more we can do that, the more you'll find it becomes much easier to have compassion, much more difficult to get angry with anyone, just automatically, because the way we're thinking and speaking through the correct perspective. So, for instance, if someone is engaging in some harmful behaviour, we normally direct at the person. Rather, we should be directing at their behaviour. So we can be very strong in the words we use, directing at their behaviour, and at the same time have compassion for the person. And I think if we do that, and if they're a little bit open-minded, they will sense the compassion that we have for them, because we're not directing at them, we're directing at their negative behaviour. And so they're more likely to listen to us and then understand that actually the thing they're doing is very harmful, and maybe try to change that. So it really just comes down to changing the way we think and speak. And unfortunately, we've grown up this way. I mean, it's a disaster. I mean, like, how often do we see when a very young child is misbehaving, the parent goes, bad girl, bad boy. I mean, it's a disaster. It's a disaster, really.
He becomes.
Yeah. That's right. Because then the child identifies with this. No wonder children grow up with low self-esteem and self-hatred, because their parents keep telling them that they're bad. Rather than, when the child is misbehaving, that thing you're doing is very harmful. Please stop that behaviour. Then the child can still feel good about themselves and not go into low self-esteem and self-hatred. And unfortunately, this, of course, is epidemic. And unfortunately, often the solution people do, when it's being offered, is do the opposite. Tell the child they're special. I mean, this is a disaster. You're special. Because then, instead of identifying themselves as bad, they'll identify themselves as special. And this doesn't work because, one, it could lead the child to think they're better than everyone else and put other people down. And of course, they can never live up to that title of special. And when they don't, they crash even further. So, whether we cognitive fuse on the negative or positive is a disaster. Like, you know, on the positive side, cognitive fusion also leads to difficulties, problems. If someone, like, let's say someone is doing a good action, what do? We praise the person. Yes. Oh, you're a great person. You're a fantastic person. You're a good person. What happens there, of course, is big head. Oh, yes, I'm really great, aren't I? I'm, in fact, better than everyone else. So rather than praise the person, which is based on cognitive fusion, which is not helpful, it just encourages people to think they're superior, praise their behaviour. That action you did was fantastic. And then the person will be encouraged to do that action again and not just get a big head. So on the positive, praise the person. Same with ourselves. If we do a good action, don't praise ourselves, think we're special. Praise our behaviour. Acknowledge and rejoice in our positive behaviour. Yes, that thing I did was great. I'm going to keep doing that. And that's going to be very helpful. So whether on the negative or positive, cognitive fusion just leads to a lot of difficulties. Yeah.
Something bothers me because, as you said, if a child, not if, children do behaviors, all kind of behaviors, and some grown-ups continue to do bad behaviors over the years, and some not. So it's hard for me to see it always as mental confusion, because there are people...
It's always, what, sorry? Cognitive fusion.
Confusion, like...
Cognitive fusion.
Fusion, cognitive fusion, right?
Right, yeah.
There are grown-up people who regularly do good things, and it's right that in every one of us there are good and bad.
Sure.
But we see it when people say in any occasions about people, some doing many, many bad things and some doing many, many good things. So
Correct.
It's not always, I know it's for therapy is very good, because if we are confused, we can look at the actions and not at the person. But sometimes it's not the solution, because it's okay, anger is bad, and this is good to deal with people, to focus on their behavior and not on their character. But sometimes you see people that do not all the time, but almost all the time, evil things.
Sure,
and
sure.
others.
Sure.
So it's not always...
Yeah. When I say the solution, I don't mean doing this, we're going to stop doing all harmful things. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I'm suggesting is that if we do cognitive fusion, we're going to make things much, much worse.
Right.
If we do this, then we have the starting point to improve ourselves. But of course, we all have mental afflictions. And we need to work on overcoming mental afflictions. And we can reduce them by applying antidotes. But the Buddhist perspective is the ultimate solution is we need to get rid of this. Because as long as we've got this, you're always going to have mental afflictions. So what I'm suggesting is that as a starting point is to stop do cognitive fusion, because that's easy to do in terms of just changing the way we think.
Basis.
The basis.
Okay.
And if we do the basis, then we can start to have compassion for ourselves and address our negative behaviour and start to work on improving it. And then we can apply all sorts of other antidotes to help reduce that. This is short term. Long term, we need to be working on getting rid of this.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to be looking at next. Sure.
So we have to work on...
Well, I didn't understand how to answer the question.
I think her question was that if we stop cognitive fusion, then that's not the solution in terms of getting rid of all of our bad behaviour. And I never suggested that it was. What I was suggesting was that cognitive fusion leads to making the situation worse, more mental afflictions, more suffering, more anger, less compassion. That if we stop cognitive fusion, we can stop increasing our mental afflictions, and we can start to improve the situation by having compassion for ourselves and others and addressing the negative behaviour. But then, of course, how to address the negative behaviour, then we need to look at many different approaches on how we can work on reducing that. And then the long-term solution from a Buddhist perspective is that all negative behaviour and mental afflictions is really coming from this. So the long-term solution is we need to eliminate this. In the short term, we need to directly work with our mental afflictions and behaviour and try to reduce any mental afflictions and negative behaviour in the short term.
Something? This is very interesting distinguish that you made, and I wonder where do you see it exactly in the Buddhism philosophy, where
Yeah, I
Maybe-
mean, yeah.
I mean, you made this distinguish. It's very.
This distinction comes in many areas in Buddhism. What you won't find in Buddhist text is this word. This word you won't find. But what they're talking about comes in many different areas in Buddhism. What I've done is tried to bring all those things together using a simple term that we can understand.
It comes from the idea of the independent, that there's no such thing as.
Well, cognitive fusion,
Yeah.
this is just one example. I mean, cognitive fusion just means fusing two things together, making them one. And there are many ways in which we do that wrongly. Here, one example is we fuse ourselves to our behaviour. But equally, we fuse ourselves to our thoughts, we fuse ourselves to our emotions, we fuse ourselves to our memories, we fuse ourselves to our personality, we fuse ourselves to our body and mind. So there are many ways in which we do this fusion.
This is related, am I right? Is it related to the third idea?
So what I'm explaining here is I'm using this in relation to particularly this, anger. So this is a particular way of working with anger by stopping cognitive fusion with ourselves and others with behaviour. This is just one example or one way in which we fuse.
Yeah, but what I was trying to ask, is it an example of the way that we see people independently? When we say, he is this person...
I mean, not directly. Of course, if we understand this at the deepest level, there's no way we could do cognitive fusion.
Yeah.
But we can avoid cognitive fusion and still not understand this. Yeah? But if we understand this, there's no independent me world, there's no way we could do cognitive fusion.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah?
Thank you.
What kind of reassurance does the Buddhistic philosophy give instead of stable things? For me, stability is the condition for sanity, right? The sun is going to rise tomorrow for the baby, the mother is going to come when he's crying.
Yeah, but here...
So what
yeah,
is
but this
that
is...
relative?
Yeah. So I think you're using the word stable in a different sense. You're using it in terms of predictable. Here, stable means not changing from one moment to the next. That's all it means. We're not using the word stable here is that the sun always rises in the morning in the east. That's nothing to do with stable. That is to do with predictable. That through causes and conditions, we can predict that certain things regularly happen. That's fine. If you want to say that's stable, that's fine, but that's not how the word stable is used here. We're not saying because things are not stable, everything's chaotic. We're not suggesting that at all. All I'm saying here is that there's nothing that remains the same from one moment to the next. That's all. Not whether or not there is some regularity with things. That, yes, there is. Of course there is. But so I think you're using the word stable in another sense, in terms of being predictable or having some regularity. That's fine. No problem there at all. So, in fact, that is completely in line with Buddhism in terms of causes and conditions.
But also, a baby will have to learn that his mother sometimes no, of course, yes, but sometimes she will be mad and sometimes she will be,
Okay. What I'd like to do now, before we take an afternoon tea break, is I want to look at attachment. Because anger is something generally we understand is very destructive, and we need to liberate. Oh, one last point on anger, and this is why sometimes there's confusion. In Buddhism, we're talking about getting rid of anger altogether. But I think in psychology, they talk differently. And I think it's not that they have a different point of view. Rather, it's they're using that word anger to have a different meaning. Because anger in Buddhism, the word anger is defined as always the intention to harm. Whereas I think in psychology, anger maybe is defined differently. So maybe in psychology, we talk about some maybe healthy types of anger and some unhealthy types. Because anger is defined differently to that. But in Buddhism, the word anger, always inbuilt in that word, is the intention to harm. So we need to keep that in mind. Right, attachment.
What is a healthy anger in psychology?
It's motivating.
Yeah.
That
I mean, I read...
It will create a
In
healthy
fact,
anger.
I read a book recently by a fairly highly regarded psychologist, and he was trying to refute Buddhism and saying, you Buddhists have got it wrong. And it became plainly obvious to me that his understanding of anger from psychology is very different to how that word is used in Buddhism. So it's not like psychology's right and Buddhism's wrong. It's just they're both using the same word to mean quite different things.
Okay.
So we need to understand that. Otherwise, there's a lot of confusion. You know? So in Buddhism, the word anger, in that, is always the intention to harm. Intention to harm. Okay. Attachment. Now, attachment is often a very different story. Because here again, we're talking about eliminating attachment altogether because it's harmful. But then people think, well, hang on, if I get rid of attachment, isn't my life, isn't it going to become very bland and boring? I mean, how am I going to enjoy anything if I don't have any attachment? In fact, it's exactly the opposite. Our attachment actually interferes with our enjoyment of the simple pleasures in life. And we know this from our own experience. If we have strong craving and attachment for something, our mind gets quite agitated. And then, of course, if we don't get that thing, we often become very frustrated. And even if we get that thing, often we're worried about not getting enough or losing it. So actually, while we have it, we're not really even enjoying it because we have this agitation in our mind. And then, of course, when it finishes, we get disappointed. So this is what attachment does to us. And it's even worse than that, because attachment is always looking for something better. And we know this from our own experience. If there's something we enjoy now, maybe there's a certain food we enjoy eating, if somehow we eat it every single day, after some time we go, oh, not that again. The reason being because attachment is always looking for something bigger, better, and different. Bigger, better, different. So if we get the same thing too often, attachment eventually goes, sorry, that's not good enough anymore. Give me something bigger, better, and different. So we actually lose out on enjoying the things that we used to enjoy because of attachment. And this was very much highlighted to me some years ago when I did my first long meditation retreat. I was in this retreat centre in Spain, side of the mountain, nice little cabin, beautiful view. They were providing meals. I don't like to cook in retreat. And the meals were quite nutritious, but basically the same menu every week. So normally if we get the same menu every week, after about 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, we go, oh, not that again. Even if it's sort of quite okay. Actually, what happened to me was after about a month, 5, 6 weeks, I was thinking, wow, the cook's really putting more effort into the cooking. It's much better than now than at the start of the retreat. And then a few more weeks went by, and it kept getting tastier. But I realised the cook's not doing anything different. It's exactly the same food,
than I got 6 weeks ago. What was happening, of course, is being in meditation retreat, the craving and attachment was slowly settling down. And what was happening then is I was actually being more present with the food and actually tasting it and not projecting or expecting anything. And so I was actually enjoying the food more and more and more and more. And not only that, what I found was I was in a cabin, and like I said, I was on the side of the mountain, had a very spacious, very nice view. But again, if we're living in a place that has a nice view, after some time, it doesn't even register. It's like, so? When we first go there, we go, wow, fantastic view. After a month, whoop. I found the exact opposite. I found after a month or 6 weeks, even little things around me are going, wow, that's so beautiful. A little bit blade of grass, little flower was becoming more and more beautiful. It wasn't, but what was happening is because my attachment was reducing, I was appreciating these things. Attachment really suffocates appreciation. Really, we won't be able to appreciate anything because attachment always says that's not good enough. I want something bigger and better and different, always. So if we reduce and eliminate attachment, we'll actually enjoy the simple pleasures in life much more than we do now. Much more. But then people go, okay, maybe I can understand that, but definitely I'll need attachment to have a relationship. Without attachment, there's no basis for a relationship. Again, exactly opposite. And here, again, I think it comes down to a terminology difficulty. Because again, in psychology, attachment is defined quite differently. And again, in attachment theory, there are healthy forms of attachment we need to actually develop, like the strong bond between mother and child. But of course, there are unhealthy attachments we need to eliminate. So attachment there is this sort of bonding or connection. This is not how the word is defined in Buddhism. Of course, in Buddhism, we need to develop a strong bond, not only mother and child, but a strong bond and connection with everyone. But this is not attachment. Again, attachment is defined as the mental factor which sees the object as attractive, it exaggerates the object's attractiveness, and then wishes to possess and hold the object. So in a relationship, of course, we have love or loving kindness, which is the wish for the person to be happy, and we have attachment, and usually they're mixed together. So we don't see that there's actually two things going on. There seems to be just one dynamic. But actually there's two dynamics going on all the time. A healthy one of love or loving kindness, and an unhealthy one of attachment. So love or loving kindness in a relationship, of course, is simply the wish for that person to be happy. The fine print is without expecting anything in return. Unconditional love. Conditional love or strings attached love is love polluted by attachment. And that sounds like this. I will love you as long as, and here comes a condition, as long as you keep saying and doing things that make me happy. If you stop doing that, I'm going to stop loving you. So of course that's love polluted by attachment. So attachment's all about me, 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 me. And actually in a relationship, attachment sees the person not as a person, but as a thing, as an object to satisfy me. So it's very dehumanizing. So very simply, the difference is, love is saying, I want you to be happy. Attachment is saying, I want you to make me happy. That's attachment. So we need to distinguish these two dynamics and try to increase the love part and decrease the attachment part. Now, the reality, of course, is that attachment pervades our life. So it's not like, okay, by next week I'm going to get rid of all of my attachment. It's not going to happen. In fact, to fully get rid of attachment, we have to get rid of ignorance. What we can do is try to reduce attachment as much as possible and thereby improve our life. One more point on this, and that is here, in terms of love or loving kindness, Often you'll hear in Buddhism that we are to love everyone equally. And then people get a very strange idea what that means. People think, oh, I have to spend the same amount of time and behave the same way to everyone? This is not what it means. If we tried to do that, it would be a disaster. Love everyone equally. Remember, love is not, in Buddhism, it's not a behavior. It's not even an emotion. Love or loving kindness is an aspiration. It's a wish. It's the aspiration or wish for ourselves and others to be happy. We can develop that aspiration equally to everyone. We can equally wish everyone to be happy. How we implement that, of course, will depend completely on the relationship. To our partner, we would express that loving kindness in a very intimate way and spend a lot of time with them. To the same aspiration, we would implement or express that to our family members in a different way, and we would express that same loving kindness to our work colleagues and neighbour in a very different way and maybe spend hardly any time with them. But we can have the equal aspiration to wish everyone equally, wanting them to be happy. That we can try to do. But then there's usually sometimes one more resistance, and that is people go, okay, maybe I can see that, but I'm a creative person and I need attachment to be creative. Again, completely the opposite. Yes, it's true, mental afflictions like craving, attachment, jealousy and anger provide a lot of fuel for creativity. How many songs have been written about these things? But they're not the source of creativity. The source of creativity comes deep within our own mind. And as long as our mind is